Welcome to the First Team College Football Recruiting Show with former NFL QB Matt Sims, Irish Breakdown recruiting analyst Ryan Roberts, and former college long snapper Joe DeLeone.
We're back here on the First Team College Football Recruiting Show. Joe DeLeone joined by former NFL QB Matt Sims and Irish Breakdown recruiting analyst Ryan Roberts. Today we are talking about early signing day, which is coming up on the 21st of December, that being next Wednesday from the taping of this show. And we're going to be talking about 5 of the top classes in the 2023 recruiting cycle, talking about some of the big names to know, some of the big headlines for these recruiting groups, a lot going into today's discussions to help prepare you for when signing day comes around, for knowing, hey, these are the best groupings. These are the best athletes, some of the guys that maybe we missed and didn't talk about for this 2023 recruiting cycle. So much coming up on today's episode. The 5 teams that we will be talking about, that being Alabama, Georgia, Notre Dame, Texas, and Ohio State. So plenty of talented players, especially some of the ones that we've already gotten to so far on this show. And guys, no surprise here that we're starting things off with Alabama of all schools. It is yet another year where the Crimson Tide are finishing at the top of the recruiting rankings. And it's justified for the fact that they're finishing the cycle right now, as it stands, with 3 5-stars and 24-star recruits, and some of the big name players that we talked about on the show that they have commitments from at this moment of this taping. Caleb Downs, the star safety, and then most importantly, Keon Keeley, the top edge recruit and arguably the best recruit in the class, as well as some other notable names: Justice Haynes, the running back, cornerback Jaleel Hurley, and then wide receiver Jalen Hale. Guys, I want to focus on Keon Keeley, though, who recently committed this past week to Alabama. It was kind of expected. There was still a possibility that he recommits to Notre Dame, but it didn't end up working out. Ryan, I want to kick it to you first because you had spoken to Keon or had been covering Keon for his commitment to Notre Dame and then eventual decommitment. How important do you think that this signing is of getting a player of Keon's caliber, who we talked up a ton? How important is that for this Alabama recruiting class?
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously covered him a ton, right? Working back to the Edge show, he's, in my opinion, I think he's the most talented player in the 2023 recruiting class. A former Notre Dame commit that have, made the decommitment, made the choice. Obviously, there were some variables that he wanted to kind of make sure that he took care of on the Alabama side, and that's mostly is the track record that Alabama has putting guys into the NFL, right? The track that they'll be able to put him on to being that next in line of edge rusher after a Will Anderson leaves for the NFL this year, right? So it made a lot of sense why Keon opted for that. And I mean, it's huge for Alabama because I think that what we've seen this year, or just this past recruiting cycle, is Alabama's getting unseated a little bit as far as being the recruiting power. Teams like Georgia and Texas A&M and some of those schools are now really getting into the conversation with them. Alabama, I feel like, is a little pissed off, right? I think that we're seeing that with Nick Saban and a little bit more. I mean, he always has effort in the recruiting trail, but I think there was a little bit of, there's a target on some people's backs this year for him to try to show that, like, hey, I'm still here, man. Alabama's still here. So getting a guy like Keon Keeley, a premier edge rusher in this class, in a really deep edge group, but I mean, he is, in my opinion, head and shoulders in that first tier as far as the best edge rushers in the class. So, now combining with guys like Caleb Downs, with the running back duo of Richard Young and Justice Haynes and Jaleel Hurley and Jalen Hale, the really talented wide receiver out of Texas, I think it's just kind of a cultivation of Alabama getting back on top of the recruiting scene.
Yeah, I mean, I think Keon is just a huge win for them. I think really at the end of the day, the main focus for this Nick Saban team and for this program is just to get back into dominating at the line of scrimmage like they did for so many years. And I think Keon is a perfect piece for that. His athleticism, his length. At the end of the day, the games that they struggled this year, they just didn't affect the passer enough and not consistently enough. And this is why I think Georgia has kind of taken that seat, like you mentioned earlier, Joe, as far as being that power in the country, because they're a little bit more physical. They dominate the line of scrimmage on both sides of the football more often in big games. And that is really the separation between them and the rest of the country in this recruiting trail. And I think Nick Saban is going back to, just the foundation of what got him to be Nick Saban in the first place. Let's make sure that we're dominating the line of scrimmage. Let's make sure that we're playing physical. And the other aspect too is with all the names that Ryan mentioned earlier, he's adding speed to the team again, which is vitally important in the SEC.
Yeah, and I'll say this too, Joe. Keon Keeley was a foregone conclusion to Alabama. As soon as he decommitted from Notre Dame, everybody kind of knew it, right? There were some Notre Dame fans that were kind of holding off for hope. Oh, he's going to come back at some point. It was like, probably not going to happen. Ohio State tried to put their hand in the ring, and Ohio State actually did a tremendous job trying to get into the conversation, but everyone knew the moment that Keon decommitted that there was a reason for it, right? And that was Alabama. Obviously, he's a Florida kid. Stays down south in SEC country. I think it's a great fit for both sides, and I think that he is, like Matt said, they got a lot more explosive at edge. And one thing that they haven't had over the last couple years as much is Will Anderson's like 6'3", 6'4". He's got good length to him, right? Dallas Turner's about the same size, but they haven't had that like 6'6" long arm dude in a couple years, right? So having that type of length and speed profile on the edge, I think he's going to be an immediate contributor for Alabama next year.
Yeah, absolutely huge getting Keon for this grouping. And like you're talking about, Ryan, as soon as he decommitted, it wasn't really a surprise because the recruiting pitch for getting him to go to Alabama is, hey, look at what Will Anderson just did. Look at some of the guys in the track record. And as good as Notre Dame's trajectory is on defense and having a really talented player in Isaiah Foskey to look at, even though he had a little bit of a down year this year, having those types of guys weren't enough for Notre Dame to keep Keon Keeley. And this is huge for this class. It is very easy for them to recruit talented defensive players. The one thing I do draw my attention to is how they're trying to fix the receiver position because they did lose guys to the portal. They also had a really down year at receiver this year. That was their big issue. And Matt talked about the line of scrimmage. The second biggest issue that we saw in a lot of games is that Bryce Young was protected well, was dancing around, and had nobody to throw the ball to. He had to make a lot of plays with his legs, which is not necessarily his bread and butter. His best attributes are being tactile with his decision-making as a passer. Now, the three guys, or a number of the guys that they signed that stand out in this class are Jalen Hale that I mentioned earlier. There's also Malik Benson in this class, and then Jaron Hamilton, all four-star recruits. Right. Do we think that these guys are enough for Alabama to take that step back to the quality of big name receivers that we've had in the past? Or do we think that maybe they're missing a five-star guy that they should have been going after?
No, I think they got a lot of talent in this class. I think Jalen Hale, especially the wide receiver out of Texas, is a really talented kid. And I mean, you have seen what Alabama's done at the wide receiver position in the pretty recent future, talking about guys like Jerry Jeudy and Devonta Smith and Jalen Waddle. Like, those guys all contributed as freshmen. And Alabama's not in a great spot. I mean, I would argue this is the worst wide receiver room as far as production-wise that they've had in several years. And you lost Trayshawn Holden. You lost JoJo Early. Anderson, the freshman wide receiver, transferred, even though he didn't really play this year. There's a lot of question marks going into next year, but the one comfort you have is that they are continuing to recruit talented wide receivers, and they've shown that they have the track record with the development at the position to let guys play as freshmen and contribute. So it's going to have to be concerted effort. Some of these guys, and again, I'm going to point at Jalen Hale most of all, they're going to have to come in, they're going to have to compete because there's not a lack of talent in the room. Just for whatever reason, the 2022 version did not click like it has in years past. So I think they still did a tremendous job on that side of the football, and I think they're going to have a couple freshmen that are going to have to contribute next year.
Yeah, they absolutely are going to have to take part in the offense immediately and have an impact to some degree. And you said it, Ryan. The biggest thing, really, it's just really hard to replace 4 or 5 NFL guys in the past 3 or 4 years. And the fact is that they hit on so many great route runners, explosive football players that are now playing in the league, and it's hard to replace them in that short period of time and to always, strike gold that often. The key is, just like on the offense and the defensive side of the line of scrimmage in the receiver room, at the end of the day, one of the main things that you're talking about in these situations is depth for your football team. The more depth that you have, the easier it is for you to develop people within the proper time frames that each individual needs. And right now they're getting just guys that again, like we've discussed multiple times throughout this show, high football IQs, guys that really love the game of football. And, despite the fact of this new NIL world out there, at the end of the day, I think people still believe that Nick Saban is the guy to help build them into men for the future.
And I think that we took it for granted for a few years there, Matt, with guys like Judy and Devonta Smith and Jalen Waddle, that it's not always that easy, right? Like pipelines are absolutely a thing, but there's going to be a down year occasionally, right? Like you're just not going to hit every single year.
Sure.
It doesn't happen. So I think that this could be the class that gets that back on track a little bit. It definitely has to be more productive than what we saw this season, though.
For sure. But I mean, hey, it's a down year for Alabama, and they were on the cusp of making it to the playoff again. So that's where it's also like, our expectations for them are obviously have been skewed in just one direction just because of their dominance. But, you have to believe that if this was a stock market, and they were a particular stock, you're going to keep investing in Nick Saban and their upward trend as being a reliable, just foundation to this college program.
Yeah, never a down year for Nick Saban, as he's always going to find a way to recover. However, his former assistant Kirby Smart is still hot on his trail, who came in at second this year, which I know, again, surprise, 1 and 2 is Alabama and then Georgia. Georgia currently has 2 5-star commits, 18 4-stars as of the taping of this show. Some of the key names to know in this class: cornerback A.J. Harris, edge Samuel Mpemba. Should have asked Ryan how to pronounce that one ahead of time. Linebacker Waylon Wilson.
Mpemba, you did well.
Mpemba. Okay.
Mpemba.
Offensive tackle Monroe Freeling, tight end Pierce Spurlin, and then defensive lineman Jamal Jarrett. We talked about a number of these guys, and one of the things, the reoccurring theme when we were talking about these Georgia commits, which it felt like on a weekly basis, there were not only 1, but 2 guys every freaking defensive week. But the approach that we've seen the minute that Kirby Smart stepped in at Georgia to still now up until this date that has produced success is that they're building up front. They're building with linebackers. They're building with really talented defensive linemen of varying body types. Some guys that are hulking masses like a Jordan Davis. Some other guys that are a little bit more speedy and fluid like a Nolan Smith. This approach, what are our thoughts on this? Do we think that this is the way to go and that maybe more teams should be replicating this? Matt, let's go to you first.
This is definitely a philosophy that I believe in and would definitely implement in my program if I were a head coach. I'm just one of those people that I think just maybe the way that I was raised with my father and, learning football through the Bill Parcells, Bill Belichick type of defenses and attitudes and physicality that, to me, there's no doubt that this is the reason for their success. You got size, you got speed, you got guys that are fearless and just hit with the tenacity. When you watch Georgia games, it's crazy, but it's just like turn the volume up and you're going to be like, man, like there is just a car crash on every play, and that to me is just what's so exciting about it. It's just like every play somebody is getting cracked, and Kirby Smart, man. I don't know what he's doing to entice these guys to go there, but, listen, he's doing it. He's doing well. He is finding phenomenal football players. All the guys that are on the list that you mentioned are just extremely, high-level guys that just need a little fine-tuning. Very exciting time for Georgia, and I totally agree with their philosophy of building through strength and speed.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, I'll say it like this, and I think Matt already hit on it. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Just improve it, right? And that's what think Georgia's doing. I mean, because if you look at some of the names on this list, I mean, A.J. Harris is a 6'1.5" corner with length and speed, right? Samuel Mpemba is a 6'4" defensive end that has vines for arms and is still a little bit raw as a football player, but just a stupid athlete. Waylon Wilson is an incredible athlete on second level. Monroe Freeling is 6'7". And Matt, I remember when we did the offensive tackle show, you're like, how does this kid move like this, man?
No doubt, right?
Ridiculous athlete, right? So I think up and down, you're seeing length, you're seeing explosiveness, and that's how Kirby's built it, man. I mean,
and even with Pierce, right, at tight end, I mean, just their ability to find these sneaky athletic tight ends that kind of do a little of everything is unbelievable too. So whoever has that eye has really got it going too, because Pierce is a very talented football player.
Yeah, and I think that each one of these players mirrors what they've had in recent years and just maybe
Right.
taking it up a notch potentially, right? Because you talk about having Tyson Campbell, Eric Stokes, now having Keely Ringo. Well, now replace him with an AJ Harris, a corner. That's the same mirror. It's the same prototype that you want at the position. Pierce Spurlin. Obviously, they have a Brock Bowers right now. Well, let's get another explosive athletic tight end that can maybe fill that mold after he leaves. Jamal Jarrett, who we talked about, that is a hulking 6'6", 330-pound guy. I mean, what they did with Jordan Davis was awesome. So, let's get that same recipe. So I think that...
And what's the update, too, with Jordan Hall right now, Ryan? Because he was projected at one time to go to Georgia, correct?
I don't think that he's signed yet. I need to actually look back up into him. But
even that, the Jamal Jarrett and then the Jordan Hall tandem in the inside part of that defensive line, that would be scary.
And even last year, you had the linebackers. You had N'Kobe Dean, Quay Walker, and Channing Tindall, who were all incredibly athletic players. Getting a guy like Raylan Wilson, who's a little bit of an undersized, just pure speed linebacker. Right. I think you have a recipe, and you're just finding the proper ingredients that continue to make that recipe work.
Just a quick final thought on this Georgia class before we move on to the next one. I also think, too, the structure of this roster is very unique in the way that they recruit allows them to do this. You're talking about all the raw athletes that they have. I would argue that a lot of times having raw athletes on your defense and getting them on the field early doesn't always really work out. It doesn't necessarily work out for every single team, but because a lot of these guys can play off of each other's strengths, I think that's why this roster building philosophy works the way that it does. They don't need guys that maybe are as close to their ceiling as other programs do. I think of Keely Ringo, who's the perfect example of talking about that, because he's raw as all hell, but he is extremely athletic and he's a really talented corner, but doesn't play always up to that talent on a week-to-week basis because he's still, in a way, learning the position. And that's what we get with a lot of these guys. It's focusing on athleticism, maybe not going with the highest rated kid because they're already actualizing that talent, but it's instead going after the guys that they can mold into really good football players that are really, really good aggressive athletes.
Totally. And I think Georgia, the main thing that they have going for them, unlike a lot of the other teams in the country, is the fact that their too deep is as good as exactly. A lot of people's starting groups. Yep. And that's where, to me, just that whole staff has done a phenomenal job of just finding the right pieces, allowing them to develop, and playing in them in certain specific situations that allow them to gain confidence and to be, super effective for their football team.
And that's the separator between the elite teams and the good to very good teams, right?
Right.
You have some good and very good teams that have, the stars at top, right? You have 2 to 3 guys where you're like, those are our dudes. And then we just have a bunch of solid football players. Georgia's one of those teams, Joe, to your point and to Matt's point as well, that across the board, they have so many talented players that not one guy necessarily has to be a star on a week-to-week basis. One week, it may be Keely Ringo. The next week, it's going to be Nolan Smith. The next week, it's going to be Jalen Carter. And not many teams in college football can lose a guy like Jalen Carter, for instance, that's going to go in the top 5 in the NFL draft this year for a decent amount of the season and not lose a beat, right? That doesn't happen. Right. And that's what they've built at Georgia, and hats off to Kirby Smart and his staff, obviously, for that.
Now getting on to our next class, talking about Notre Dame, which we'll try to keep this not dominating the whole second half of the show because we've got two Notre Dame homers here, and one person who's very tapped into this Notre Dame recruiting class. Which
make sure you clarify who those 2 Notre Dame homers are for the fans out there.
It's me and Ryan. And
That's
Ryan, right. It's perfect that we're bringing up Notre Dame. They're currently rated 3 on a lot of recruiting boards right now because Ryan has all the inside info on this grouping. And right now they've got 1 5-star commit, 21 4-stars. Some of the key recruits to know about: safety Peyton Bowen, offensive tackle Charles Jagasaw, athlete Jeremiah Love, linebacker Drake Bowen, tight end Cooper Flanagan, and then recently they got the commitment after flipping a Pitt commit, quarterback Kenny Minchie. So the one thing that I'd like to talk about here, and this is, I need to preface this by saying this is not any shot at the recruiting efforts by the Notre Dame recruiting staff or the coaching staff rather, because this is a top 3 class. But at one point, this grouping was number 1 in the country, and then it kind of trickled down a little bit to this 3 spot. So Like Ryan, I just want to ask you this, like, in all seriousness, like, is there any concern there, or was this inevitable that they were going to finish more at 3 at the end of the cycle, and it was just kind of the early way things were shaking out?
I think even if Notre Dame had held on to Keon Keeley, they would still have ended up not as a number 1 team when all is said and done, just because the Alabama, the Georgias, they're going to trickle in some 5 stars late. That's kind of how their trajectory usually goes, right? So I don't think it actually hurt them too much, Joe, and I'll be honest about that, because I think that what you see with Notre Dame right now from a class perspective is, yes, would they love to have a Keon Keeley in the class? Absolutely. Who wouldn't, right? Every team in the country wants a Keon Keeley. But Notre Dame has still done a really nice job of balancing this class. I mean, 4-man wide receiver group, 5-man offensive line class, 4-man defensive line class, 3-man linebacker group, 3 safeties, 2 corners in the class, got a quarterback, tight end. You've hit all your needs from a numbers perspective, and you've gotten a lot of talented football players. This is the most speed that Notre Dame has brought into class in some time. I mean, they have legitimately 2 kids that are 4.3 something athletes. They have 2 other kids that are verified in the 4.4s. They have a lot of athletic kids that are coming, and the balance, I think, of the class is what separates Notre Dame and why they are still sticking high at number 3.
Ryan, I'm so glad you said it, because, like, to me, that is just the main thing with Notre Dame. The main thing is the main thing with Notre Dame. Speed, 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 speed. You can't let teams like Marshall come in and look faster than Notre Dame, right? And that's my issue with Notre Dame. It's always been one of my issues with them these past 5 or 6 years in that college playoff hunt, because to me, I just don't think they have enough overall team speed like a Georgia, like an Alabama in the past to compete on that level consistently. And we saw Cincinnati, they had that speed for 1 whole year, and all those guys are now playing in the NFL and playing extremely well. But nonetheless, that is definitely the thing that I think Notre Dame did a great job of this year, adding overall team speed, adding depth, and of course, just keeping a focus on just being super dominant on the defensive side of the football as much as possible, and making just every team work for everything that they get, playing physical, confusing quarterbacks, hitting quarterbacks, stopping the run, and I think that is really just the main thing that they have to continue to focus on, for their, next phase of this program with Coach Freeman at the head.
Yeah, and I mean, that speeds across the board in this class, Matt, which is really exciting. Like you mentioned,
Absolutely.
You mentioned Jeremiah Love, Joe. I mean, he's a 4.4 kid that's going to play running back for Notre Dame. They have Braylon James, a wide receiver out of Texas, that is a 6'3 kid who has verified in the 4.4s playing wide receiver. You have Peyton Bowen, who's a 4.3 athlete playing at safety. You have Micah Bell, cornerback out of Texas, that is probably the fastest man in the class. He's a 10,300-meter runner as a track and field athlete. Drake Bowen, the linebacker, who I know we were all big fans of, who's an incredible athlete. Offensive tackle Charles Jagasaw, who you mentioned, Joe, who's a little bit raw at this point, but a freak show athletically. So I think that is the biggest point, is that you hit all your needs in this class outside of Viper, even though they still pulled a pretty nice 4-man defensive line class overall, but you filled all your needs and you added a lot of team speed to this team.
And then you got John Schuler, too, a 6 foot, 180-pound corner that's a good-looking player for them. Brandon Hillman, an athlete as well for him, 6'1", 190. These guys, I think, just have that NFL measurable, too, that they need, to compete on that upper level.
The main thing, too, and throwing out all these names for this class, you see a real transition for the recruiting efforts by Marcus Freeman from what we were used to with Brian Kelly.
Yes,
there was a lot different of an approach. I even just look at the quarterbacks that they recruited to what we're going to be getting now in the future with a guy like Kenny Minchie. But just in general, you're talking about how slow they were, Matt. They weren't necessarily recruiting a lot of high-end athletes. It was a little bit more of an old school roster construction. And now you do see that new age of let's get as many athletes out there as possible. We're going to kill guys with speed. We're going to kill them with athleticism, and we're going to develop these guys to play within the scheme that works the best. And I know that, Ryan, for a fact that you're a fan of this construction, and it is promising, even though they did have a bit of a disappointing year based on what I think the expectations were coming into the season. They still are reloading with a recruiting class that is better than anything that they've gotten in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's a tremendous class. Marcus Freeman has taken the recruiting efforts up a notch. There's no doubt. I think one thing that Marcus Freeman has done is he has changed the ideology of recruiting. There were the areas in the past where Notre Dame frequented, the Catholic schools in certain areas where that was their stomping grounds. Marcus Freeman has opened up that scope. It's no longer about the Notre Dame fits, right? It's about seeing the players that with the correct support can fit at Notre Dame. It's a little bit different, right? It's a little bit different. So they've widened the scope. Here's a great stat for you, Matt. Ready? In this class, in the 2023 class for Notre Dame, they have 5 commitments out of the state of Texas, okay? Previous 5 years, they had 3 total. Why is Notre Dame not dipping into Texas? Why are they not doing that? It's a hotbed of talent. The fact that they have 2 more guys in one cycle than they had the previous 5 years from the state of Texas says all you need to know. You're widening the scope. For whatever reason, Brian Kelly and his staff did not think that they could go down into the Lone Star State and recruit at a high level. They didn't think that they could compete for those types of guys. And I think that Marcus Freeman has changed that ideology to say, we're going to compete with everyone. We're going to have some misses. We're going to have some hits. But we're going to go down to the best areas, and we're going to find the talent where it fits at Notre Dame.
That's a great point.
Just to wrap Notre Dame before we transition, Father Hesburgh would be rolling over, knowing that is the transition in the recruiting efforts that they're doing. Because I think back to I try to consider myself to be a little bit of a historian of the background of Notre Dame recruiting, or not Notre Dame recruiting, Notre Dame football. And it used to be impossible to get onto this football team because of the academic restrictions that they had. And to know that they're doing this now is going to really help them get a lot better.
I need one more point, Joe. One more point.
Go ahead.
I think that there was too much.
Do you want 20 more minutes?
There was too much of a narrow scope, though, because I'll use Braylon James out of Texas as a example, right? He's a wide receiver out of Texas. Before Marcus Freeman took over, he did not hear from Notre Dame. A 4-star kid, top 100 level receiver out of the state of Texas who wanted to go to Notre Dame. He reached out to Notre Dame twice, no return phone call.
That's
and
crazy.
Then Marcus Freeman gets the job, and they widen the scope. And you're right. It's very difficult to get Notre Dame, and it still is. But the fact of the matter is that Braylon James is a 3.9 student who graduated early from high school in the state of Texas. And Notre Dame didn't even give him a look because I just think
could go to Princeton if he wanted to,
Right. Matt, he was probably Texas wanted him bad, TCU wanted him bad, South Carolina wanted him bad. If he didn't end up at Notre Dame, I bet you he would have ended up at Stanford. That's what type of kid he is.
And the thing I think that Notre Dame has to keep in mind, right, is that when you walk in the door, any mother, father, parental guardian is going to be so extremely thrilled to know that their son is potential to wear the Golden Dome helmet, right? The fact that they just have to understand their presence when they walk in too. They bring a whole nother level of prestige with them that, I don't really care how many championships you win at Georgia. Notre Dame brings a certain aura to it every time, no matter what. So they have to continue to be a national power that way.
Now, though, guys, and I totally agree with all those sentiments, Matt, but now's the time to ask ourselves the favorite question that every college football show and recruiting show will ask themselves. Is Texas back? They are the number 4 team right now by a large number of recruiting outlets out there. They're currently finishing with 2 5-star commits, 11 4-star commits. They are in the hunt for Anthony Hill, who is a 5-star linebacker who decommitted from Texas A&M. The current key commitments that they have, and a number of these we have discussed: quarterback Arch Manning, the premier jewel at the top of this class; Cedric Baxter, running back; wide receiver Jonte Cook II; safety Derek Williams; and then cornerback Malik Muhammad. Guys, I just want to address this here first. Do we think that this class is maybe being a little bit carried by having Arch Manning being the premier guy of the grouping? Is that what has pushed them up to this point where they are in that number 4 slot? Because outside of that, they don't have that many 4-star recruits compared to the guys in front of them, and also even Ohio State, who's behind them. Matt, I want to go to you first. your thoughts on Arch Manning and maybe the significance he has for making this recruiting class look really strong.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that Arch Manning holds a little extra weight to how this class is being looked at. I do think that Coach Sarkisian has done a really good job of just trying to fill in some of the spots of his team that, again, like we discussed with some of these other football teams, I think one of Texas's main issue, like we discussed, like similar to Notre Dame, is just, not enough depth on their football team. Right. And at multiple positions. And that includes the quarterback position. Same with Notre Dame. At this point, I'm glad that they got Minchie. I'm glad that they got Manning. They need to keep being super active with recruiting quarterbacks because, with transfers now in the portal, it is so quick from going to having a full room to having one or two people in your room or potentially one guy for a bowl game. So it's nuts. But, Texas, nonetheless, I think has done a good job of just getting a well-rounded group. They're definitely just trying to add some size all over the football field, it seems like, when you look at everybody's measurables. And I believe that Sarkisian is going to try to fall back into the line of what he saw Nick Saban do a lot. And that is trying to get big people up front, trying to add size and length, and at the end of the day, making sure that he has a quarterback that can lead and just kind of propel his program forward. And I think Archie Manning has the potential to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it's buoyed up a little bit by Arch Manning, and I mean that's what most classes are, though, right? Like quarterbacks do buoy them a little bit. I mean,
sure.
Joe, I would say this though. I think one thing that we lost sight of with Texas this year is that everybody wanted to talk about Sark. They want to talk about Quinn Ewers. They want to talk about Xavier Worthy, Bijan Robinson, the great offensive weapons they have.
Right.
But I actually thought the Texas defense took a nice step forward this year. I thought that they had a lot of really good moments. The defense, I actually think, is a little bit ahead of the offense in Texas right now. So I think one concerted effort you're seeing on this side of the football for Texas, I mean, yeah, you got a Malik Muhammad, who I think is an incredible press man corner who's going to play a lot of football at Texas next year. But bringing in guys not only like Arch Manning, but bringing in Cedric Baxter, who's a big physical runner who's going to have to play next year because you're going to lose Bijan Robinson, you're going to lose Roshan Johnson. You're going to need an answer at running back. Bringing in a Jonte Cook, who is an incredibly talented wide receiver, to go with Xavier Worthy next year. Isaiah Nayer coming back from injury. Jadavion Sanders, the really talented tight ends. No, I think Texas really is trying to get that offense to him because that's what we expected under Coach Sark, is that the offense will take that massive step forward. I think next year is the year that maybe that offense does take that step, and the defense with its improvement over the last year, that's when you see Texas getting closer to being back. So I think that it's a intriguing class because I think offensively, Sark and this coaching staff have done a good job of acquiring a lot of offensive talents to an already pretty talented room.
Now, if they add Anthony Hill, that is definitely going to really bolster the group, and they'll have one of the highest 5-star totals out of any of these recruiting classes. Really quickly, I want to try not to go super far down this rabbit hole because I know that we definitely can, because I'd like to get to Ohio State before we wrap. However, Quinn Ewers had a little bit of a rough end of the year. Do we think, and I know that everyone's going to be asking this question for the next 8 months or however long it is until the start of the season, does Arch Manning start day one? Yes or no?
No.
I say no, but I would think that the leash for Quinn Ewers is going to be very short. I see a very similar situation of the Spencer Rattler, Caleb Williams situation that took place in Oklahoma. We know the one guy is good, but at the same time, too, the demand to see the next guy is higher, and that's kind of how I see this potentially playing out.
That's a good comparison. I would also say DG Uiagalelei with Cade Klubnik behind him is another decent comparison.
Absolutely.
We've seen those, right? I think you saw the flashes of Quinn, but then you saw the downside of Quinn at times too, where you're just like, it's just too much peaks and valleys. Like the good is really good, but the bad is just unplayable at times, right? So I think that he's going to be the starter to begin the year, but to Matt's point, I think that there's definitely going to be a constant evaluation of, hey, you got to prove you're the guy, or else there's a guy behind you that's very talented as well.
And just to defend Quinn really quickly, I think just the one issue that happened this year is that, he's playing, he's earns the spot. He's doing well. He gets injured, kind of throws him for a little loop there, can't quite get back on the horse and just go right into it the way that he did. So just, at quarterback position, just continuously need reps and experience. And this is a guy that didn't play for a whole year at Ohio State. So, this spring will be absolutely huge for him. The only difference now is that Archie Manning will be, right there behind him.
He also, and it doesn't get talked about enough, was dealing with a number of just random different injuries. So like you kind of saw those things catch up to him at times this season. That's context that it's not like the NFL where we're constantly getting injury reports. So you know, down year for Quinn doesn't mean that he has doesn't have a resurrection next year. Hopefully his confidence isn't brought down like we saw with DJ Uiagalelei and what inevitably led him to leaving Clemson.
Right.
Guys, I want to get to this last recruiting class to wrap today's show. Ohio State, who it's been kind of like a back and forth. The final three that you see on all these different sites, on three, Rivals, 24/7, you either get in a different order, varying order. It's somewhere of these three teams, Ohio State, LSU, and Texas. But for the sake of today's show, talking about Ohio State, they have 1 5-star recruit, 17 4-star commitments. Some of those big names: wide receiver Brandon Inniss, wide receiver Noah Rogers, offensive tackle Luke Montgomery, defensive lineman Jason Moore, wide receiver Carnell Tate, and then tight end Jelani Thurman. Now, you guys might be noticing it's a little bit of a trend here. There's a lot of receivers, a lot of offensive players. That is how this team is being built. It is a polar opposite roster construction in a way from the one that we talked about earlier with Georgia. Their approach has been and always will be, let's get as many talented receivers as we can get. We're going to develop them, and we're going to have the best receiver room in the country. And that has led to some really gaudy offensive statistics. It has also led to some defensive woes over the past couple of years against Michigan in particular. But Matt, I want to kick it to you first, being our offensive guru here, being a quarterback.
Thank you.
Having these having these receivers and going with this approach to building a roster, like what is the difference for the approach that Georgia has? Do we think that this is the right approach despite some struggles recently?
Well, I think the more, the way we have to look at this a little bit more narrowly to begin with is everyone's main goal is to win their division, their conference, right? So their focus is Big Ten football. Big Ten football across the board is, built on having strong front lines, right? Kind of playing that old school brand of football, where Ohio State has flipped that on its head is just being more explosive than the other people that they're playing against. We know how tough teams like Iowa and all these other football teams, they got these really good front seven people, but Ohio State changes the game by just stretching the field vertically way more aggressively with their quarterbacks, with their skill players than all the other teams that they compete against. So they might be a little bit lacking in the physicality side at times, especially in the defensive side of the football. But when you're making explosive plays over and over against your opponent, that's great defense in itself too, because your offense knows that it can't keep up with them because they're just on another level, right? So that's what's exciting, I think, for Ohio State and just their premise. Where they kind of get into issues is when they play teams like a Michigan or a Georgia or an Alabama who can, match up athlete for athlete, schematically be on top of what you're doing, and then also win up front being more physical. So this is where I think, Ohio State has dropped the ball a little bit at times, but nonetheless, their success for their conference is extremely good, considering their woes against Michigan lately.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to recruit right now at Ohio State at wide receiver, right? We talked about this with Alabama, but it's like you just had two players drafted in the top 11 last year, and Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave both balling out as rookies. You're going to have a Jackson Smith and Jigba drafted this year. Next year, you're going to have Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka. Like it's
and who are we really talking about? Like, let the people know, Ryan.
It's wild, man. What Brian Hartline has done at that position, bringing in now guys. He is the dude, and bringing in guys like Brandon Inniss and Noah Rogers and Carnell Tate. Not to mention also bringing in a guy like Jelani Thurman, who's a talented tight end too. So another talented pass catcher. Ohio State's going to have plenty of options for whether it is whatever quarterback it ends up being next year. And I know they have a couple nice young guys, obviously, that are kind of waiting in the wings. But for me, it is a little bit of a does there have to be a little bit of a philosophy shift at some points? Because to your point, Matt, yes, it looks great in most weeks, and it does. I mean, again, especially against teams that you are clearly more athletic than. But when you go against the Michigans, when you go against the Georgias, the Alabamas, are you going to ever be able to just out-athlete those teams? That's the question, right? So,
right.
And especially on this team, you're losing Paris Johnson Jr. You're going to lose DeLeone Jones. You're potentially going to lose Luke Whippler up front. You're going to lose a couple defensive linemen. You're losing a lot, and they're going to ask guys to now have to reload at those positions that maybe you haven't prioritized as much as your pass catchers, your athletes. So I think that there might have to be a shift at some points. But, I mean, again, there's talent coming into Ohio State, as there always is, and it's at the spots where we routinely see them develop at the highest level.
For sure.
Yeah, and part of me wonders also, and like a lot of the things that we're bringing up here, is this roster construction and approach maybe why that they have struggled at the end of seasons where it's cold, it is terrible weather in the Midwest, when you have to go travel to play at Michigan, sometimes this stuff doesn't work as much. And you look at where you need important players at certain positions, it's up front. It's bringing physicality and being able to match that physicality. And I think a really perfect example is how they played against Michigan is that they didn't have that physicality. Some would argue that they looked very soft going against that Michigan team. So this is a good approach if you're in the Pac-12. This is a good approach if you're playing in a very warm southern area. And I think that there have been really good results at times, but it seems like they're straying away from producing well-coached defenses, physical defenses that haven't really been playing up to the caliber and to the tone that they need them to. I know that it might be a little bit in the weeds and a little tinfoil hat of an approach, but like you're talking about, Matt, like the Big Ten, you have to kind of go shot for shot and be able to play physical games if you want to win. All right, guys, it's a great note to wrap us up on. We'll be monitoring signing day, and I'm sure that there's going to be some commitments that are dropped in throughout the day or the week leading up after the show airs. At Joe DeLeone, at Rise and Draft, at Sims Complete QB, thanks for tuning in. We will be back with more, folks. Enjoy the rest of your week.